CSET, the Center to Support Excellence in Teaching. And I'm Janet Carlson, the director. I am not normally this casual when we have a speaker as dignified as that. It is Denim Day. Does anybody know what Denim Day is? What is it? I caught you I purposely look for that.
I read it from Brazil. That there was some event in the court in Italy that was very sexist. That they said some, I don't remember exactly the event. But then the next day, the senators that were female, they all came in, and it all goes again.
Yeah, so it was in Italy, and there was a trial about a rape, and the woman who was the victim was wearing tight jeans. And the justice said that because her jeans were tight, she must have helped the rapist remove her jeans in order for this rape to occur, thereby implying consent. The next day, the women in the Italian parliament all came dressed in jeans. And so Denim Day was born around the world. So many people in CSET today are wearing denim. We actually typically dress up when we have a speaker, as our speaker did. So I wanted to just give a little explanation of why I look so casual on an important day like this. So I'm happy to introduce Evan Fishman, who, as he explained to a couple of you, is a postdoctoral scholar here in the Graduate School of Education, and in particular working on a project that is one of the repertoire projects that the CSET has. Today he's going to actually talk about work he did before he came to Stanford. And it's a really nice link between thinking about learning from the academics that you think kids should learn and what it takes for those academics to happen. And the nature of this talk series, which happens once a month during the academic year, is the Pondering. So I ask every speaker to share their work with us and leave time for the pondering. And each speaker builds that in his or her own way. So Evan's already got a plan for what that means. So Evan, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to thank Janet for inviting me here, and thank everyone for coming. It's always cool when people volunteer to listen to your research, so it's a big plus. So yeah, the title of the talk is Academic Motivation, How Teachers Impact Students' Causal Thinking. And I think that the format is the best if you feel free to raise your hand or ask a question while I'm talking. I think that's probably the best way to do it, if you have something to say or something to ask. So the first thing that I want to talk about is what causal thinking is. It's called causal thinking because it has to do with thinking about what caused an event or a certain outcome. So for a student, this happens quite a bit throughout the day or throughout the life of the student. For example, why did I fail that exam? Why didn't I get into that college? Why couldn't I understand that text? So things like this initiate the causal thinking. And the research shows us that depending on how the student answers those questions has strong bearing on how the student feels and reacts following those events. And this doesn't just happen for, sorry, I'm distracted by this thing. It doesn't just happen for the academic world of the student, it happens for the social world as well. So things like, why didn't they invite me to study with them? Why didn't Jimmy ask me to prom? And part of that social world includes teachers. So things like, why is this teacher being so mean? Why is this teacher going so fast? And this doesn't just happen for students, it happens for everyone, and that includes teachers. So, for example, the research shows us that when a student fails a test, the teacher is much more likely to consider that student responsible for the failure if they attribute it to a lack of effort as opposed to a lack of ability. So you can imagine how those two different attributions have different effect on the student's relationship with the teacher and how, on the student's own sense of their capabilities. So because it happens so often and because it happens in every domain of life, it has been called perhaps the most fundamental internal process for producing thought and action. So just a little bit more about that. So these outcomes that initiate that process can be self-related actions, so your own behavior, and your own situations. Or it can be about other people's actions, behavior, and situations. And the outcomes that are negative, unexpected, and or important tend to elicit more causal reasoning than other types of events. But sometimes something can be so positive that it's surprising, and you think about, why did that happen? And this type of thinking occurs automatically, so most of the time we're not even aware that we're doing it. And so just a little closer look at this process. So those outcomes that I was talking about, we can also refer to them as stressful events. So after these stressful events, people ask why. Why did this happen? And this is also called causal search. So for example, here's Nancy Kerrigan. Not only did she ask why internally, she asked why out loud. She was very distressed. And so the answers to those why questions are called attributions, or causal attributions. And each causal attribution falls into at least one of these dimensions. So the cause, or the reason for the event, is either internal or external of the person, stable or unstable, controllable or uncontrollable. And each of these dimensions are linked to certain psychological and behavioral consequences. So because of those consequences, some attributions are considered maladaptive and some are considered adaptive, depending on how they're linked to those behavioral consequences.
If it's not further in your slides, could you give examples of how combinations?
I actually do talk about that. Yeah. So, and if you have more questions about it, feel free. Okay, so why do we do this? Well, for a long time, attribution theorists have said that we do this to regain a sense of control over our environment, because after these stressful events occur, we kind of lose that sense of control, or that sense of structure around our world. But recently, studies have shown that students who engaged in more causal search actually made more maladaptive attributions, experienced more shame, received poorer grades than students who made less causal search. So there's kind of a discrepancy here, so it's not just enough to engage in this process. In fact, more causal search is actually indicative of someone's low perception of control. So I started thinking more about why that is. But just to refresh your memory about what perceived control is, there are different versions of perceived control, like self-efficacy, for instance. But in a general sense, it refers to the combination of an internal locus and a perceived capability to influence daily events, or influence the environment. And this is an extremely important psychological construct for our functioning as human beings. So it's been positively related to a whole host of beneficial outcomes. Okay, so let's think about this more conceptually. So let's pretend that this is you. It could be anyone, but let's pretend that it's you. And the green background indicates that you're doing well, you're feeling good, you're perceiving control over your environment. But inevitably, something will happen, that stressful moment that seems scary will happen. And after that, you're not going to feel so good. You're going to lose that perception of control over your environment. But I started thinking, there are, even though we can't control that event, we can't influence that had happened or influence that's happening, we can influence how we think about that event. So that's what that green circle there indicates. So I wondered, if people did perceive control over how they think about the event, would that perception of control buffer the negative effects of that event and help you regain that sense of control and sort of lessen the impact of that negative event? So that's the kind of idea conceptually. And so I developed a theory called perceived control of the attribution process, which consists of two subconstructs. So first is perceived control of attributions, which refers to an internal locus and perceived capability to influence one's own causal attributions. So someone who adopts this belief is likely to endorse a statement such as, "It's up to me to determine why things happen." The second one is the awareness of the motivational consequences of attributions. So this refers to an understanding that attributions have motivational consequences. So an understanding that they are linked to those certain consequences. And these are thought of as implicit beliefs, so you might not even be aware that you endorse these beliefs until someone asks you or until someone presents it to you. And one of the ideas is that they help people retain the motivational benefits of control because they receive control over how they think about things, or think about those stressful events. So now let's take a look at an example of how it might work for a student. So this student here, he raised his hand in class and he wasn't called on. So an event like this is likely to initiate the attribution process. So to try to figure this out, he might think, my teacher doesn't like me, or he might think, my teacher didn't see me. So these are two possible explanations for that event. So I thought just maybe you could take a couple moments and just talk with the person next to you about how these two different attributions might have different impact on the student's behavior, and they might have different consequences. So just take a couple moments to do that.
They both cause an action, but one of them's a negative non-action.
He said, oh, she doesn't have.
No, no, exactly.
There's nothing except for just trying to get a wider range. It's not relationship. Trying to get more people involved.
Yeah.
Like never thinking that there's a
My teacher doesn't like you. The truth is, your teacher doesn't like you.
All right, so I heard a lot of good conversations about that. Does anyone want to volunteer, sort of what their group thought? Sure. Yeah.
Well, obviously with a teacher, when if a student thinks my teacher doesn't like me, they're going to probably act in a more negative way, whether it be slouching or talking to someone else or getting upset. My teacher didn't see me, they may give the teacher another chance, not react so quickly, and try again.
Right, yeah, so that's more or less, yeah, so I mean, it's kind of common sense, and I'm sure everyone's been in situations like this. So let's say that the teacher, he decides that the teacher doesn't like him, that's why he wasn't called on. Well, this is likely to, make the student feel bad, like you said, and he's likely to shy away from future class participation, so you can see that there's psychological and behavioral consequences. So this is considered maladaptive attribution. Let's say that the student decides that my teacher didn't see me. Well, in this case, it's likely to prevent those bad feelings, and he's likely to continue participating in class, give his teacher another chance, like you said. So this is considered an adaptive attribution. But let's say that the student feels that it's up to him to determine why he wasn't called on. And he's aware that determination will affect him. He's likely to choose the one that makes him feel good, or just not make an attribution at all. He's not going to worry about it. He's just going to focus on what can be controlled in the future. So that's how this student did perceive control over his attribution process. So let's take a look at just an example for a teacher. So I'm sure for most teachers have seen this. This student is sleeping in his class, and so an event like this is likely to initiate the attribution process. So he might think, I'm a boring teacher, that's why he's sleeping. Or he might think, this student's been working too hard, that's why he's sleeping. So you can just imagine how the different impact these two attributions would have on the student and teacher's relationship, and so on. And so, but if the teacher did feel that it was up to him to determine why the student was sleeping, and he was aware that determination will affect him, he's likely to, choose the one that makes him feel good, or just focus on something else. And actually, I don't know if you've seen this video, but we don't know if the teacher did perceive control over his attribution process, but he did deal with it in a funny way. He got everyone in the class to start clapping, and this video is not going to work on here because I'm using a Mac, but anyway, he gets everyone to start clapping, and the student wakes up and starts clapping, and everyone.
That's clever.
Okay. So this is kind of the conceptual model of that process that I was talking about. Okay, so down here is the traditional attribution process. And this is just driven by automaticity. It's your default process. Like I said before, you don't even know that you're doing it most of the time. So in that case, sometimes you might choose the maladaptive attribution, because it just depends on your causal antecedents, your past history, the way that your brain is wired. But for people that do perceive control over the attribution process, they can disengage from that process and avoid the negative motivational consequences of those maladaptive attributions. And so people that do perceive control of the attribution process are more likely to engage in cognitive reappraisal strategies, depending on what kind of event it is. So, for example, they might consider other causes for the event, and they might focus on the consequences of those attributions. And if they do engage in those strategies, or have a tendency to engage in those strategies, they're more likely to choose the adaptive attribution. But even if they don't choose an attribution or engage in those strategies, they're more likely to perceive or feel autonomous and experience more well-being than people who don't perceive control over this process. Yeah.
Did you ever involve in your study to find out what part of the brain is lit up when they're making these decisions or when they're feeling these ways?
I have not. I would love to do that, but I haven't worked with any neuroscientists at all. So, but in the future, I would love to do that. It'd be pretty cool.
A reptilian, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's the idea basically. And so to be able to measure how these beliefs actually impact people, I had to develop a scale. So that's what you're looking at here. And you can see there are PCA items and AMC items. So ultimately, or one of the PCA items is ultimately, I'm the one who determines why things happen. And one of the AMC items is my feelings about an event depend on my thoughts about the event. So those are just two examples of those scales. So now I want to talk about some empirical evidence that these beliefs have some merit and they affect people. So this is the most recent study I did. There were 800 graduate students, or 800 participants. 3% of those were graduate students. The rest were undergrads. And particularly interesting for this audience is probably that majority of those students were in teacher education program, and almost all of them were already student teaching in schools. Okay, so if you think back to that conceptual model that I showed you earlier, these are the measures that I used to help validate it. So I used DC and Ryan's autonomy. Well-being was a composite score of life satisfaction and positive and negative affect. I used the ASQ for attribution style, and for those cognitive reappraisal tendencies, I used the positive reinterpretation scale from the Cope instrument, and this just asks people or students how likely they are to do these things following stressful events. So a sample from this is, I try to see it in a different light to make it seem more positive. So that's one of the things from that scale. And so this is the final empirical model. I'm not going to go through everything on here, but just wanted to tell you that each of these paths are significant, except for these two, which actually makes sense and was part of the model, because these beliefs are not likely to influence attribution style unless someone has a tendency to cognitively intervene following those stressful events. And so you can see that the model predicted autonomy, it predicted all of these dependent variables. And something else interesting is that Oh, those numbers just show that the model fit the data well. And these colored lines just indicate that the paths were mediated significantly. So cognitive reappraisal mediated the first tier of this model, and an adaptive attribution style mediated the second tier of the model. Yeah.
What did you exactly ask them, or what kind of questions did they answer? Were there the list of questions that you had shown?
Yeah, it was a survey.
Oh.
So here, let me go back. So those questions that I showed you, these were the PCA and AMC items that I asked them.
Oh, okay.
And then, and these are already established scales. So yeah, they're all questionnaires and surveys.
Do you know how early their mindset starts with these type of thoughts? Like, I mean, did
yeah,
they?
you would think that the older people would have more tendency to adopt these beliefs. And actually, that was one of the, so I did control for age, and the older people were they were more likely to adopt or have an awareness of the motivational consequences of those attributions. But that's pretty much all I did with age so far. But it does make sense to think the older someone is, the more likely they are to have that awareness. So yeah.
Though it's sort of skewed in your sample because they're in a path with higher education.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's the possibility that education is playing more of a role than
And-
age alone.
Oh, yeah, well that's true, yeah. Everyone was, do you mean, what do you mean by that?
That I think, and I don't have some literature-based stuff to be completely wrong, I think choices to pursue an undergraduate degree, go into teacher education, to be in a graduate program, you need some ability in that causal piece of life to understand you have some control over your life.
Yeah,
And so sort of the more educated somebody is, potentially, the more that's actually contributing than their actual age. And your
Yeah.
whole sample comes from a population that has chosen.
that's true actually, yeah. So there are studies that show that students who don't perceive control over their academic environment are much less likely to even enroll in college.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I kind of think about those two things separately. You know, that's more perceiving control over your environment. This is more perceiving control over your internal environment. But there probably is a connection, some kind of correlation there. Okay, so do you guys have any more questions about that? Or?
This may be something that fits better later in your talk. I'm wondering if there's paths you would consider of particular significance if I'm thinking from either a teacher role or a teacher educator role. Like, what are the things I should think about the most when I'm interacting with students or I'm preparing people to work with students?
Yeah, that's actually something that I want to do eventually. And actually I will talk a little bit more about that. And I'd like to talk with everyone about that because I think it's a good audience to do that with. Okay, so so one of the claims in the model is that these beliefs help students retain the motivational benefits of control in situations of uncontrollability. So if you think back to that little monster, that's kind of what I'm talking about. But to do this, I had to, so this is the first question I asked, or one of the questions I asked. Does the controllability of the event for which attributions are made significantly influence one's PCA or AMC? So is there a difference between controllable and uncontrollable events? So to do this, I had to look at specific events, but these beliefs are actually general. They refer to all events, but to answer this question, I had to look at specific events. And if there were a difference between controllable and uncontrollable events in levels of these beliefs, if I accounted for that contextual dependency, would these beliefs still predict positive outcomes? And so what I did was I asked students to describe a situation that was unexpected, a situation that's likely to initiate the attribution process. And then I asked them, how much control did you have over the event that you described? And so I took those answers and categorized them into controllable and uncontrollable events to see if there was a difference. And so here are two actual events that were described by students. So there's an uncontrollable and a controllable event. So why don't you just take a couple minutes and just read those so you have an idea of which is which. So those are just two examples of what the two different types of events would look like. So there was a difference between controllable and uncontrollable events in levels of PCA. And the same was true for levels of AMC. So in other words, students were more likely to endorse these beliefs in controllable situations as opposed to uncontrollable situations. Which makes sense, kind of, if you think about it. You know, if an event is controllable, you think that you could control it. You also think that you can control how you think about it. So I wondered if, knowing that there is a dependency on what type of event it is, if I controlled for that dependency, would these beliefs still predict positive outcomes? And so what I found was that the interaction term predicted autonomy, still predicted cognitive reappraisal, and attribution style, it didn't predict well-being. So, but that was at the event level. These beliefs are actually general, especially because it depends on which event it is. So these beliefs are different from event to event. So when you ask somebody about generally, you get a better idea of how they really endorse these beliefs. Okay, so what? So what can we really take from this? Well, there's a couple takeaways that I think are important. So students and teachers who adopt these beliefs have a motivational advantage over those who do not. And this might be because these beliefs allow one to retain a sense of control in the face of uncontrollability, because they feel capable of exercising internal actions when external actions are fruitless or not possible. So what can educators do? Well, I wanted to tell a story that I heard recently, actually, about a teacher, and I think it relates to a lot of teachers, actually. So this teacher, the quality of his teaching was great when he thought his students were well behaved. But when he had a class like this that was not so well behaved, his teaching was not so great. Actually, he sort of made, he took it personally. He made internal attributions for his students' behavior. And he made that attribution, and he actually ended up cursing at one of his students. And this was an elementary school class, so you can see how important it is to make adaptive attributions. But if this teacher can somehow realize that he is the one who determines why his students are behaving that way, and knows that it's important to make that determination because it will affect him, he's more likely to end up like this teacher. He's better equipped to handle situations like that. So teachers can reflect on their own causal beliefs, and they should do that. So these types of lessons can be incorporated in teacher education programs, because sometimes it's not enough to just convey how students learn, how students think. It's important to convey how teachers themselves think, especially when it affects their own students' learning. And in school, teachers can help their students understand the impact of their causal thinking and demonstrate that those causal thoughts are under their control. So for example, there are interventions called attribution retrainings that have a long line of a long line of research that show that they're very effective in helping students change their attribution style to a more a better attribution style. In general, this is referred to in a learning context as a motivation-enhancing treatment that can offset maladaptive explanatory mindsets arising from adverse learning experiences.
How
So,
young can that be done?
what's that?
How young a student has that? done?
I think that, I don't know what the youngest is, but I know that it probably can be done with, middle school age students. But this group, Perry and colleagues, they work mostly with high school and college students. And in these attribution retrainings, they tend to emphasize effort attributions because more times than not, making it an attribution to effort is the adaptive attribution. And these are especially helpful for low-performing students do better in school and feel better about school. So some would argue, and I would be one of those people, that attribution retrainings actually promote a perceived control over the attribution process. Because what they're doing is they're teaching students that they make attributions, that they can control these attributions, and that these attributions will affect their motivation. So the next steps for me, hopefully not too far in the future, is I'd like to continue designing interventions that are similar to those attribution retrainings, but that have elements of counseling psychology. For example, rational emotive behavioral therapy is a technique that helps people become aware of their irrational thoughts, and mostly these thoughts are beyond their awareness. And the therapist helps them realize that they have control over these thoughts. And similar work is being done in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, where they're finding similar results. And the reason that I really like these types of interventions for students is because they help them in both the learning and social aspects of school. Because we know that students who are not functioning well in their social world are not going to function well in their academic world. So, yeah. So one of the last things I wanted to leave you with is this quote from David Foster Wallace, who, this is from a commencement address that he gave a couple of years ago. I think he does, the whole speech is really good for putting this concept into lay terms, but this is just one of the quotes from that. He says, if you're automatically sure that you know what reality is and you're operating in your default setting, then you, like me, probably won't consider possibilities that aren't annoying and miserable. But if you really learn how to pay attention, then you will know there are other options. The only thing that's capital T true is that you get to decide how you're going to try to see it. This, I submit, is the freedom of a real education, of learning how to be well-adjusted. So the last thing that I always like to do is to challenge people to think about this in their own life, to ponder this. And I'm guessing that, well, first I want to say that, if you do think about this, next time something happens in your life, maybe in your classroom that seems stressful, just know that you have control over how you determine the cause of that event, and that it will affect you, that termination. You're going to feel better about it. It's going to lessen the impact of that event. So I'm kind of wondering if there's anyone, like while I was talking, that thought of an event that came up maybe in their classroom or just in their lives, where these sort of perspectives would have been helpful for them.
I'm thinking about a reoccurring thing I've had happen in teaching, and I'm just gonna call it like struggling student A, who actually through their own control, and they recognize this, maybe they've struggled to do their homework or to participate in class, and it's getting toward the end of the quarter, and they kind of see the writing on the wall in terms of how they're doing, and they come to you and ask you, like they're ready, like the last 2 weeks to like bring it back, and then they do, they'll really try to engage, and yet even at that point making those choices, it might be, even though they're now in control, it's a little bit beyond their control based on the amount of time or weeks that they spent not engaging. And so how do you deal with that issue of, like, you really talked in terms of context of, like, things beyond your control, like that teacher who had to teach that class when it was only the second time in her life that she'd been in a classroom observing, like, that's obviously beyond your control. But how do you coach kids when there are some things within their control, when they're ready to listen, and then they feel like it's kind of beyond their control because of how much it's snowballed? Is that, I don't know if that's, yeah, and it's a reoccurring thing with kids who struggle in school, probably because of a lot of the social part that doesn't make the academics successful for them, so.
Yeah. I think, well, so this is something that I encounter a lot when I talk about this, because sometimes it's hard to make the distinction between, students who perceive control or don't perceive control over things in their environment that, and that's sometimes called primary control. But what I'm talking about, at least here, is that they can control how they think about that. So if the question is how can we help students promote that belief that they can control how they think about it, I think things like attribution retrainings are really good. There are interventions that from Dweck and colleagues that kind of show that when students have, they think the nature of intelligence is malleable, they're more likely to make effort attributions and achieve better. So those interventions are simply just showing the students how the brain works and that the brain can learn and it changes. Because the students that think that they're just born this way, if they're not good at math, they can't get better, then they're not going to even try. So I think that's a really effective intervention, or just a lesson that you can show your students just about how the brain works and that the nature of intelligence is malleable. And yeah, sure.
I just thought, first everybody kind of gains traction in the classroom at a different point in time. So, I mean, praising